Unit 4, Biological Psychology. Presentation 5, Workplace Stressors.
In this presentation, we'll be concentrating on the problem of work stress. Everybody feels work-related pressures at some time in their lives. When that pressure becomes excessive and the person suffers an adverse reaction to it, then it has become stress.
There are many aspects of the workplace that might be considered stressful. These include having too much work to do or not having enough control over working practices. Whether or not these will cause a stress response in the individual depends on other factors, such as their ability to cope and the amount of social support they receive from others.
The main study of workplace stress was carried out by Michael Marmot and colleagues in the 1990s. They were interested in the possible association between work stresses and the risk of heart disease. This study is referred to as the Whitehall 2 study because it concentrated on London-based civil servants in 20 government departments in Whitehall. It was a follow-up to the original Whitehall study, which began in the 1960s. This was a longitudinal or prospective study in that the civil servants were first examined between 1985 and 1988 and then followed over a period of approximately 5 years. The study involved over 10,000 civil servants aged between 35 and 55. 2/3 were male and 1/3 female.
At the initial baseline examination, each participant completed a questionnaire. This provided information on different aspects of their work environment, such as the amount of control they had over work-related decisions and their overall workload. Independent assessments of the nature of each worker's environment and job responsibilities were obtained from personnel managers. The questionnaire also provided information about the participants' physical health, particularly any evidence of heart disease.
Why did they need the independent assessments from personnel managers?
There's always a danger when asking workers to report their own workload and the sense of control they have that they may not be entirely objective. For example, a disgruntled employee might be more likely to exaggerate their workload and their lack of control in decision-making processes. By having an independent assessment of workload and control, for example by checking job specifications and role responsibilities, the researchers had a way of checking the truthfulness of the questionnaire answers.
5 years after the initial examination, Marmot discovered that those men and women who had initially reported low levels of job control were more likely to have developed heart disease than were those who had reported high levels of job control. This association could not be explained by employment grade or other risk factors, such as smoking or physical inactivity.
In other words, the critical factor in determining the onset of heart disease was the level of control regardless of the grade of job. Other factors, such as workload or the degree of social support at work, didn't appear to be related to the risk of heart disease.
Studies such as the Whitehall study are important because they identify those workplace stresses that are most likely to lead to physical or mental illness. The policy implications of this study are that giving workers a greater say in decisions about work may decrease the risk of heart disease and benefit employees at all levels of the workplace.
Other research into workplace stress. Although the Whitehall study didn't find any relationship between workload and illness, other studies have done just that. For example, Gunn Johansson's study of sawmill workers found that performing repetitive jobs that require high levels of attention and responsibility is associated with stress-related illness. The study focused on one particular group of men who worked at the last stage of production, being responsible for finishing the product at the end of the sawing process. They were expected to work at a relentless pace, and because they were responsible for finishing the timber, they were also responsible for the production rate for the whole sawmill.
This high-risk group were found to have a higher absence and illness rates and higher levels of adrenaline in their urine than the low-risk group of workers in the sawmill, who had less monotonous jobs and lower levels of responsibility.
Why is their level of adrenaline significant?
Adrenaline is produced by the adrenal gland in response to stress. It prepares the body for fight or flight. If adrenaline levels are high, then it is evidence that the individual is in a state of stress.
Before we leave this topic, I'd like to look at another aspect of workload that has been linked to stress. Most research on work-related stress has focused on work overload, or having too many job demands, as opposed to work underload, or having too few job demands. A recent study by Schultz and colleagues gathered data from 16,000 adult employees across 15 European countries. This was to determine whether work overload and work underload resulted in different health outcomes. Work underload refers to any situations where people are employed in jobs that are beneath their capacities, or where they are given tasks that are lacking in any creativity or stimulation. Work underload decreases job satisfaction and results in increased absence through sickness.
So which did they find was more stressful, work overload or work underload?
The researchers discovered that employees reporting work overload had the highest levels of stress-related illness. Those who reported work underload had the next highest level, and employees where workload was matched to their abilities had the lowest levels of stress-related illness. The results of the study support the notion that too few as well as too many work demands can be associated with higher levels of stress-related illness.
Evaluation of work stressors. The link between work-related stress and illness is supported by research findings. One of the largest meta-analyses of work stress involved over 83,000 employees across Europe, the US and Japan. This study, by Mika Kivimäki and colleagues, found that employees with high levels of work-related stress were 50% more likely to develop heart disease than were employees with low levels of work-related stress. This supports the claim that workplace stress can have serious negative health outcomes. It also suggests that not only does work-related stress have health implications for the employee, it also has economic implications for the employers because of the days lost through absence due to sickness.
The extent to which workplace stresses are experienced as stressful depends on a person's perceived ability to cope. For example, a high workload might be experienced as stressful by one person, but as challenging by another. Despite the finding in the Whitehall study that people find low levels of control stressful, having high levels of control or responsibilities can backfire if a person lacks confidence in their work. High levels of control can also be stressful if an individual has the tendency to take responsibility for any negative outcomes while at work. In a study by John Schaubrook and colleagues in 2001, workers who lacked confidence in their skills found job control extremely stressful because they couldn't use it effectively to cope with the demands of their job. This suggests that high levels of control only result in low levels of stress if the individual believes they are able to cope with the extra responsibility this entails.
Our understanding of the impact of workplace stresses is limited because the nature of the working environment is constantly changing. The nature of work, and therefore the nature of work stresses, is constantly evolving with the advent of new technology and new working practices. For example, there has been an increase in virtual offices and the blurring of the work-home environment. This means that our current knowledge and understanding of workplace stresses rapidly becomes out of date. Consequently, psychological research inevitably lags behind actual work practices.
A final criticism of research in this area concerns the validity of the techniques used to measure work-related stress. Questionnaires used in work stress research tend to emphasize the importance of aspects of the working environment that are no longer important as stressors, while ignoring others that have become a significant source of stress for most people. For example, Keenan and Newton interviewed engineers and found that many of the significant work stresses that they mentioned, such as time-wasting job demands, were not included in traditional work stress questionnaires. This means that many of the measures used in research on work stress may not actually be fit for purpose.
Before we finish, I'd like to ask a question. Given what you've just told us about the impact of workplace stressors, what can employers do to make workplaces less stressful places?
There are lots of ways that employers can help reduce stress, but let's concentrate on just a couple: workload and control. Many employees have far too much to do when at work, and this increases their levels of stress. So, rather than having to prepare the food and serve the customers, your employer could give you just one of these tasks, thus reducing your workload and decreasing the likelihood of you feeling stressed. The other thing they could do is increase the level of control you have at work. For example, allowing you to contribute to the decision-making process concerning the type of burgers you cook or the provision of healthier options for the customers.